think an era ended with Robert Kennedy's death and Martin Luther King, an era in which we could have accomplished great things working together, and doomed us for some time, and we may still be in that time, to be shattered, fragmented, and something less than the people we could be.
And I think Jack Newfield said it best when he said, after that we became might-have-beens, a generation of might-have-beens.
The Republican convention in Miami was a world apart, safe from turmoil, no blacks, no radical students, no long hair. Nixon and his running mate, Spiro Agnew, appealed to those they called the forgotten Americans, yearning for stability, law and order.
All of the crises of the 60s were coming together at once. The student, the anti-war demonstrations, the turning of the civil rights movement away from sort of nonviolent demonstrations to get laws changed to riots and quasi-revolution. And I think there was a sense that the country was coming apart, and here we were, suddenly we were losing the war.
My fellow Americans, the long, dark night for America is about to end. The time has come for us to leave the valley of despair and climb the mountain so that we may see the glory of the dawn, a new day for America and a new dawn for peace and freedom in the world.
But at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, the system was falling apart on national television.
It was one of these dreadful and amazing confrontations where the forces that have been building for a long time come into collision.
Leaders of the anti-war movement, Dave Dellinger, Abby Hoffman, and Tom Hayden, were determined to protest at the Democratic Convention.
Richard J. Daley.
Mayor Richard Daley, the last of the big city bosses, was not about to let that happen. Daley would not grant permits allowing protesters to march or hold rallies.
And as long as I'm mayor of this town, there'll be law and order in Chicago.
The city was an armed camp. There were 12,000 police, 6,000 Illinois National Guardsmen, another 6,000 Army troops, including some just back from Vietnam. There were never more than about 10,000 demonstrators, easily outnumbered by police and soldiers.
Some of us felt, I was certainly one of them, that it was altogether likely that we would not come out of the week alive. Somebody was not going to make it through the week.
Wednesday, August 28th was the day everything exploded. It began with a peaceful rally at the Bandshell in Grant Park. Anti-war organizers were still planning to march to the convention, but when a young protester climbed the flagpole and lowered the American flag, the police charged. That afternoon at the convention, Democrats voted down the peace platform. For McCarthy and Kennedy delegates, it was a bitter defeat. Back on the streets, angry, frustrated demonstrators managed to reassemble in front of the Hilton Hotel, where the candidates had their headquarters.
They were just as nasty and crude and awful and ugly as they could be. And you could see those cops were just sitting there seething with anger and resentment over it.
Under the full glare of TV lights and cameras, the police attacked. They clubbed indiscriminately, protesters, reporters, bystanders. The official government investigation would call this a police riot. In a confrontation that would be replayed countless times, Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff denounced Mayor Daley's police.
with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Mr. Daley is not pleased with Senator Whitaker.
How hard it is to accept the truth.
And he looked at Mayor Daley.
That night, Humphrey won the Democratic nomination, but it was a hollow victory.
You had Hubert Humphrey weeping in the shower from the effects of tear gas that was being spread in the park beneath the Conrad Hilton Hotel. The way it played out was extremely dramatic, but what played out there was a fact that the Democratic Party was finished.
And Nixon used an effective line after that Democratic convention. He said, look, if they can't unite their party, how can they unite the country? And he was right. But the truth was, I don't think anybody could have united us in 1968.
Just a few days before Daley called the army into Chicago, Russian tanks invaded Prague.
They made Mayor Daley look like a pacifist.
Many anti-war Americans identified with the young, free-thinking Czech students who wanted to change the old communist system.
Dubček, who represented the Prague Spring, he was like a mild reformer, and this tremendous movement grew in Prague, which thought that it was going to change the world, just like we did. And, you know, it did finally, and God bless them, but they paid a big price of almost 30 years before it finally happened.
Preoccupied with the war in Vietnam, the United States took no action to stop the Russians. The Czechs had little to defend themselves beyond their own powers of persuasion. Invited by the Czech author Milan Kundera to observe what was happening, Carlos Fuentes and other writers came to Prague.
We were witnesses to the fact that this was a revolution to give socialism a human face, as Dubček had said, and this other revolution of the year 1968 was trampled by the Soviet Union, which did not want socialism with any face. It wanted Soviet imperial domination of its perimeter of defense. To have a policy that cares for the society, that takes care of the society, but it also respects personal freedom. This is what the Czechs wanted, and of course the Soviet Union would not tolerate it. And it was the beginning of the end, I think, for the Soviet Empire.
20 years later, the Velvet Revolution ended Soviet domination of Czechoslovakia, and playwright Václav Havel, a veteran of the Prague Spring, became president of a democratic country. In 1968, there was Paris, Chicago, Prague, and finally Mexico City. This plaza, the scene of another bloody confrontation. It had been building all summer. Mexican students were on the march, challenging an authoritarian government that claimed to be democratic. On the night of October 2nd, students filled the plaza. Soldiers with fixed bayonets surrounded them. Suddenly, without warning, a helicopter hovering overhead opened fire.
They wanted something called freedom, imagine. As simple as that. They wanted freedom, and they went out in the streets to demand this freedom. And the answer of the government was to mow them down in October 2nd, 1968, at Tlatelolco, the Plaza of the Three Cultures. Tlatelolco, the same place where Pedro de Alvarado had massacred the Aztecs in 1521.